The 60s weren't just flower power, peace signs, and Beatles records. They were also the decade Hollywood started showing war in a way that felt a little too real. Blood, fire, soldiers breaking apart on screen. Suddenly, war wasn't glamorous anymore. And for some people, it was way too much. Countries banned them, censors freaked out, and audiences walked out pale and shaken. So, which war films from the 60s pushed the line so far they got buried? The Green Berets, 1968. Let's start with one of the most infamous war movies of the decade. John Wayne's The Green Berets wasn't just a film, it was a full-on propaganda project. Wayne, already Hollywood's patriotic poster boy, wanted to create a movie that would rally support for America's involvement in Vietnam. But instead of noble speeches and simple heroics, audiences got a film stuffed with graphic ambushes, executions, and a brutal climax that left theaters divided. The movie follows a group of American soldiers fighting in Vietnam, presenting them as selfless heroes, holding back waves of faceless enemies. But where most earlier war films suggested valor and sacrifice, this one drenched it in blood and moral certainty. Bodies falling from booby traps, villages torched to the ground, civilians caught in crossfire. These weren't images audiences were used to seeing in mainstream American war films. The controversy wasn't just about violence, though. Critics called the movie crude propaganda, arguing it glossed over the horrifying human toll of Vietnam. Countries like Sweden and Finland refused to screen it, calling it dangerous political theater. Even in the US, some college campuses protested screenings, with students storming theaters and demanding it be pulled. Overseas, censors in places like the UK demanded cuts to the most violent scenes before releasing it. Ironically, all the outrage made it a box office powerhouse. Audiences who supported the war ate it up, while those who opposed it often paid just to see what the fuss was about. John Wayne, of course, leaned into the anger, saying he was proud to make a film that didn't apologize for America. In the end, The Green Berets didn't unite audiences. It split them straight down the middle. Critics panned it as propaganda. Vietnam veterans called it dishonest. And yet, the movie cemented itself as one of the most controversial and censored war films of the 60s. The Dirty Dozen, 1967. Here's the thing about The Dirty Dozen. It looked like just another tough guy action movie at first. A squad of criminals offered a shot at redemption by taking on a suicide mission behind enemy lines. Sounds like popcorn fun, right? Except director Robert Aldrich wasn't aiming for lighthearted. He loaded the film with scenes so violent they shocked both audiences and censors when it premiered. From the opening, the tone was grim. Soldiers whipped, hanged, and drilled like cattle in training camps. Then came the climax, a massacre that left bodies stacked high, civilians included. The brutality wasn't dressed up as noble sacrifice. It was ugly, chaotic, and unsettlingly gleeful in its destruction. When the squad locks women and officers inside a bunker and burns them alive, audiences gasped. For many, it crossed a line no major Hollywood war movie had crossed before. The backlash was immediate. The Pentagon distanced itself from the production, refusing to provide military support. In the UK, censors hacked away at the ending, calling it a parade of barbarism. In Spain and Ireland, the film was outright banned. Even US military bases overseas limited screenings, saying the film's unrealistic brutality would harm morale. But for all the pearl clutching, the movie became a massive cultural phenomenon. Younger audiences loved its cynical take on war, seeing it as closer to reality than the sanitized epics of the past. Vietnam veterans, especially, said it captured the chaotic mix of violence, rage, and futility they felt overseas. Meanwhile, conservative critics blasted it for glorifying murder and turning criminals into heroes. Yet the very things that made it controversial also made it legendary. That final massacre burned itself into cinema history, inspiring everything from Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards to modern-day squad films. The Dirty Dozen wasn't just a war movie, it was a statement that war is dirty, messy, and, above all, brutal. And for that, censors all over the world tried to bury it. Too Late the Hero, 1969. Robert Aldrich wasn't done stirring up trouble after The Dirty Dozen. 2 years later, he delivered Too Late the Hero, another war film that refused to play nice with censors or audiences. Set in the South Pacific during World War II, it told the story of a ragtag group of Allied soldiers on a suicide mission against the Japanese. But instead of patriotic speeches and clean battles, Aldrich gave viewers sweaty paranoia, slow burn dread, and some of the most vicious battlefield violence of the decade. The film opens with a squad of reluctant men, already breaking apart under the strain of survival. Characters bicker, betray each other, and crumble under fear. And then the blood starts flowing. Executions are shown in cold detail, bayonet fights leave soldiers writhing, and the camera lingers on the shock of death. By the time the mission spirals into a slaughterhouse, it was clear Aldrich wanted to remind audiences that war chews men up and spits them out. Censors were not impressed. Japan banned the film outright, calling it insulting and excessively violent. Several European countries demanded heavy cuts before release, particularly scenes showing soldiers executed at point-blank range. Even in the US, reviewers blasted it for being too graphic and too bleak, accusing Aldrich of wallowing in violence rather than telling a story of honor. But Aldrich wasn't interested in honor. He was interested in stripping the shine off the war film and leaving only the raw nerves. And in that sense, he succeeded. Too Late, the hero bombed at the box office, but lived on as one of those film soldiers whispered about, the kind you watched when you wanted something closer to the horror they actually lived through. For censors, it was too much. For Aldrich, that was the point. Attack on the Iron Coast, 1968. At first glance, Attack on the Iron Coast looked like another adventure movie. It was a US-UK co-production starring Lloyd Bridges as a determined officer leading a dangerous raid against the Germans. But this wasn't a neat commando story. From the opening minutes, the film reveled in gritty violence, showing soldiers torn apart by explosions, burnt alive in fiery wrecks, and drowning under steel and fire. Unlike many glossy World War II films of the era, Attack on the Iron Coast made no effort to polish the carnage. Every death felt drawn out and cruel. Soldiers didn't fall gracefully, they screamed, thrashed, and suffered. The raid sequence, shot with an almost documentary-like eye, shocked censors used to cleaner portrayals of battlefield heroics. The climactic assault on German positions left the screen drenched in fire, collapsing bodies, and close-ups of men choking out their final breaths. Critics at the time were split. Some praised the film's unflinching realism, while others accused it of crossing the line into sadism. In France and Belgium, several screenings were canceled after veterans groups protested its violent depiction of Allied soldiers dying like cannon fodder. In Germany, the film barely played at all, considered too inflammatory. Even in Britain, censors demanded trims before giving it a certificate. Yet, the film found an audience among younger viewers, craving something less polished. It may not have had the star power of The Dirty Dozen, but its intensity left an impression. For a modestly budgeted war movie, it punched far above its weight in shock value. And for that reason, it remains a hidden gem among 60s war films, one remembered more for the bans and protests than the plot itself. The Bridge at Remagen, 1969. By the late 60s, audiences had grown used to war movies pushing boundaries, but The Bridge at Remagen still managed to cause uproar. Directed by John Guillermin, it dramatized the battle for one of the last bridges over the Rhine in World War II. The film was meant to be an exciting retelling of a historic victory. What it delivered instead was a grim, mud-soaked meat grinder that censors and governments couldn't stomach. Filmed partly in Czechoslovakia, the production itself became infamous. Soviet forces invaded the country mid-shoot, and the film crew had to flee. Maybe that chaos bled into the final cut, because the movie feels raw and unhinged. Soldiers are shot down in droves, villages collapse in flames, and the bridge itself becomes a stage for gruesome deaths. Explosions shred men apart in lingering detail, and bodies pile up like discarded props of war. Censors worldwide took notice. Czechoslovakia banned it outright, calling it politically toxic and overly violent. In Italy and Spain, scenes of soldiers being buried alive under rubble were cut completely. Even in the US, television networks refused to air it uncut, fearing it would traumatize viewers at home. Audiences, though, were hooked. Many praised it as one of the most realistic portrayals of late war carnage ever put on screen. Veterans called it exhausting but accurate. Critics, however, labeled it tasteless, claiming it exploited history for shock value. Still, the controversy only added to its draw. The bridge at Remagen didn't just show a battle, it forced viewers to feel the grind of it, the dirt, the fear, the crushing weight of bodies falling around them. For some, that was cinema at its bravest. For censors, it was simply too brutal to allow. Beach Red, 1967. Cornel Wilde's Beach Red didn't play by Hollywood's rules. This wasn't a clean, flag-waving World War II drama. It was a low-budget shocker drenched in blood, mud, and sweat. From the opening sequence, the film made its intentions clear, a brutal, uncompromising look at what it really felt like to storm a Pacific island under heavy fire. And unlike the war epics of the 40s and 50s, Wilde didn't soften the blow. The first act sets the tone. Marines charge through surf under machine gun fire, men are cut down mid-run, and the camera doesn't flinch. One soldier takes a bayonet straight through the stomach, writhing in pain as blood pours out. Another is blown apart in a close-quarters explosion. Wilde used fast cuts, handheld shots, and blood squibs that looked alarmingly real for 1967. The violence didn't feel staged, it felt like documentary footage spliced into a narrative. Censors balked. Australia refused to give it a certificate, citing graphic images of mutilation. Several European markets demanded major edits, particularly a scene where Japanese and American soldiers slaughter each other in a frenzy of stabbing and choking. Even in the US, it barely escaped with an R-equivalent rating, and television broadcasts later hacked away entire reels. Critics were stunned. Some praised it as a groundbreaking anti-war statement that stripped away illusions of glory. Others accused Wilde of crossing into exploitation, using gore as spectacle. Veterans were equally divided. Some said it finally showed the madness of island warfare honestly, while others called it tasteless and traumatizing. Wilde himself defended the film fiercely. He claimed he wanted audiences to feel the chaos and horror, not just hear about it. In that sense, he succeeded. Beach Red remains one of the most violent war films of the 60s, banned in multiple countries and whispered about in grindhouse circles. It may not have had the polish of bigger productions, but its raw power hit harder than almost anything else of its era. The Last Escape, 1969. At a glance, The Last Escape looked like just another late 60s war thriller, a group of Allied commandos sent behind enemy lines. But what made it infamous wasn't the mission itself, it was how mercilessly the film portrayed death. Executions, betrayals, and outright massacres filled the screen, turning what could have been a simple adventure into one of the decade's most vicious war stories. The plot follows an Allied team trying to capture a German rocket scientist before he falls into Soviet hands. Sounds straightforward, but director Walter Grauman shot the film like a nightmare. Prisoners are executed with chilling precision, complete with lingering close-ups of faces at the moment of death. There are ambushes where entire squads are shredded in seconds, and one sequence where a German officer forces captives to dig their own graves before being shot point-blank. Audiences weren't ready. In smaller European markets, theaters refused to screen it. Censors in Norway and Austria cut nearly 20 minutes, removing executions and mass shootings. In the US, it barely made it into theaters, and when networks prepared to air it years later, they butchered the film down to a tame shadow of itself. The brutality didn't just come from the action, it came from the atmosphere. Grauman kept the tone relentlessly grim, denying audiences the relief of a heroic climax. By the end, survival feels like an accident, not a victory. That bleakness was one reason censors lashed out. Another was its refusal to portray the Allies as spotless heroes. Everyone in The Last Escape seems compromised, broken, or capable of cruelty. The movie didn't become a hit, but it carved out a reputation as one of the bleakest war dramas of the decade. Too violent for mainstream audiences, too cynical for traditional war buffs, it ended up caught in limbo. But for those who managed to see it uncut, it left an impression they couldn't shake. Castle Keep, 1969. Sidney Pollack is remembered for prestige dramas, but before Tootsie and Out of Africa, he gave us Castle Keep, one of the strangest and most brutal war films of the 60s. On the surface, it's about a group of American soldiers holed up in a medieval castle during World War II. But beneath the surreal visuals and philosophical dialogue lies a film that shocked censors with its sheer cruelty. The violence in Castle Keep isn't stylized, it's grotesque. Soldiers are shot apart in sudden bursts. Villagers are executed without ceremony, and the climactic siege turns the castle into a blood-soaked ruin. Pollock lingers on the suffering, a man crushed under stone, another writhing as fire consumes him. Unlike other war films that cut away from the worst moments, Castle Keep stares directly at the horror and refuses to blink. That refusal got it in trouble. In Italy and Spain, scenes involving massacred civilians were trimmed out entirely. In Ireland, the film was restricted to adults only, with local boards calling it unfit for public audiences. Even in the US, critics complained that it went too far, one calling it an exercise in cruelty disguised as art. Catholic groups protested its release, furious over both its violence and its bleak moral outlook. Yet, for all the outrage, the movie developed a cult following. Some saw it as a metaphor for the madness of Vietnam, even though it was set in World War II. Others admired its surreal mix of art house sensibilities and battlefield brutality, but no one denied that it left audiences shaken. Castle Keep remains a divisive entry in 60s war cinema, part meditation on the futility of conflict, part grindhouse nightmare dressed in art house clothes. For censors, it was simply too much. For viewers willing to stick through the blood and chaos, it became unforgettable. Merrill's Marauders, 1962. Before Vietnam dominated headlines, Samuel Fuller was already tearing apart Hollywood's glossy war formula. With Merrill's Marauders, he delivered a film that didn't flinch from the blood and exhaustion of jungle warfare. Based on a real U.S. Army unit that fought through Burma, the movie was supposed to be a patriotic tribute. Instead, Fuller, himself a World War II veteran, turned it into a gritty nightmare that censors and audiences struggled to stomach. From the very beginning, Merrill's Marauders batters the audience. Soldiers are ambushed in thick jungle, shot point blank, or blown apart by mortars. Fuller's camera doesn't cut away, it lingers on mud-smeared faces, bodies collapsing, and the slow toll of disease and starvation. He showed war not as victory, but as attrition. The men don't just fight, they rot from within. The makeup work, showing festering wounds and feverish eyes, was shocking for the early 60s. Censors in Asia reacted harshly. Several countries, including Burma itself, banned the movie outright, claiming it insulted their national image and glorified gruesome violence. In Europe, distributors trimmed whole sequences of soldiers writhing in agony after being hit. Even in the US, the military, which had initially supported the production, distanced itself once they saw how Fuller emphasized despair over heroism. Critics were divided. Some admired Fuller's courage to portray war's psychological and physical breakdowns, while others accused him of turning a heroic story into grotesque suffering. Veterans recognized the film's raw honesty. Many said it was the closest Hollywood had come to showing what jungle warfare actually felt like. Fuller never apologized. He argued that sanitizing war was the real crime. In his eyes, showing the pain was a way of honoring the soldiers who endured it. For censors, though, Merrill's Marauders was simply too brutal, too honest, and too unrelenting to pass uncut. The War Lover, 1962. World War II bomber crews had often been shown as noble, tight-knit brothers in arms. But The War Lover flipped that script on its head. Starring Steve McQueen as a cold, reckless pilot, the film depicted air combat with a vicious edge that rattled audiences. Instead of soaring patriotism, it gave viewers charred wreckage, screaming men, and a protagonist who seemed to love destruction more than duty. The flying sequences are some of the most brutal of their time. Bombers shredded mid-air, soldiers incinerated in fireballs, parachutes riddled with bullets before hitting the ground. Unlike earlier films, The War Lover refused to romanticize these deaths. McQueen's character, Buzz Rickson, relished the carnage, treating combat like sport. That dark undercurrent turned stomachs. Was this a war hero or a sociopath? Censors had trouble with it. The UK pushed back, demanding cuts to scenes of men burned alive in cockpit explosions. In Germany, screenings were limited, as critics claimed the movie glorified American brutality. In smaller markets like Denmark and Norway, the film faced outright bans due to its grim tone. Even in the US, critics were unsettled, calling it nihilistic and un-American in its portrayal of soldiers. But that discomfort was the point. McQueen leaned into the darkness of his role, delivering one of his most chilling performances. Audiences, too, were fascinated despite their unease. The film didn't rake in blockbuster numbers, but it left behind an unsettling reputation that lingered long after. The War Lover wasn't just banned for its violence, it was banned for its honesty about the kind of men war creates. And for many censors, that honesty was simply too much to handle. None But the Brave, 1965. Frank Sinatra as a director might not sound like a recipe for controversy, but with None But the Brave, he shocked audiences with one of the bleakest war films of the 60s. On paper, it was about US and Japanese soldiers stranded together on a Pacific island, forced to cooperate for survival. What it became was a relentless meditation on violence, betrayal, and the futility of war, packed with moments that made censors flinch. At first, there's an uneasy truce between the two sides, but as resources dwindle, tensions erupt into savage clashes. Men are stabbed in desperate hand-to-hand combat, prisoners are executed without hesitation, and starvation drives the soldiers to cruelty. Sinatra doesn't spare the viewer from the aftermath, long takes of corpses rotting in the sun, men collapsing in sickness, and sudden betrayals that end with bullets to the head. Censors in Japan refused to let the film play, claiming it insulted both sides by portraying them as equally brutal. In Europe, cuts were made to sequences showing mutilated bodies on the beach. Even in the US, critics were stunned by how dark Sinatra's vision was. For a mainstream Hollywood star, this wasn't what anyone expected. The movie didn't perform well at the box office, partly because audiences weren't ready for its grim tone. But for those who did see it, it left a mark. Some called it an anti-war masterpiece ahead of its time, one that hinted at the Vietnam disillusionment just around the corner. Others dismissed it as too harsh, too cynical, and too graphic. Sinatra never directed another war film, but None But the Brave stands as a haunting reminder that even the biggest Hollywood names could push boundaries. And when they did, censors scrambled to stop it. So there you have it. 11 war films from the 60s that didn't just rattle audiences, they rattled governments, censors, and even veterans themselves. These weren't sanitized stories of glory. They were raw, violent, and often too honest for their own good. But maybe that's why they still matter. Which of these films do you think deserves a modern rewatch? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden chapters of film history.